Paul Newman was the star of The Rack.
Yeah. And Dory Sherry, nobody on the West Coast ever heard of him.
Mm-hmm.
He was only in a play in New York, and a television play he did because Jimmy Dean was supposed to do it, and he got killed before.
So you wrote that, and that's where you met Paul Newman.
I met him on a television show in New York that was called Thunder of Silence. And it was about, again, communication, about an experiment in the Deep South where they were taking those displaced persons from Europe who were either maimed or wounded or in some way incapacitated in order to put on farms in the American South to help families whose farmer sons were away at war. And they would send photographs, and the whole town would meet, and everybody would pass the pictures around if somebody was moved to take the person and pay them a small salary and give them board and room. And that was the deal. And it was a 3-year commitment on both sides. And it was changed many, many lives. And so I had written a lot of it up to a certain point. And that point was, who is my main character? I knew, and I had an idea of who he was, but I just stopped. I came to a screeching halt, as happens so often after the first half of the first act. And that was good. And then I went home in despair to my little pad in Greenwich Village, and I was going through the TV, what was on. And there were so many dramas on Studio One, and, all these great stage actors, and doing stuff during the week when they didn't have matinees to think of it. And I saw Fay Bainter playing a mother of a veteran who had just come home. And the only thing I could remember is this young actor who, in trying to find the words to tell his mother what war was like, he just sort of looked up and went, "Oh!" And she grabbed his head, and it was Paul, whom I had seen in a play in Picnic, but forgotten. He played a tiny little role. He was still playing it, had been playing it. And when I saw that, I went back to my office at our Radio City Music Hall and got a key and went in, and I just sat down where I'd left off, and I just went boom,
wow,
almost through the whole script.
Wow.
With Paul. It was Paul and the quality in him. And I gave it to Fred Coe, brought it in that morning, showed him how many pages. He said, "Keep going, and when it's finished, bring it in." And I did. And he loved it. And I said, "The only catch," and I'm on my knees to you, get Paul Newman. He said he's finishing a film out there, but I'll send it to him email. And Paul got it and read it in the bathtub the last night of his cocktail gown dress, which is what he called the silver chalice. He didn't like his knees, and he had to wear one of those chitons. And bang, he was there for rehearsal 3 days later. And I wanted to make it real for him. And this was about a boy who couldn't come home. His brother, whom he had idolized, his twin, had been killed in the war. he couldn't come home. And so he went from YMCA to YMCA, and his mother would she never knew where he was, but she'd send packages to YMCAs. So I thought, well, I'm going to make this real for him. And I went out and got an old box, and I banged up the box, and I put, stamps on it and canceled the stamps and addresses of several YMCAs, because this thing had followed him, and filled it with everything that a mother would. Socks, new socks, and shaving stuff, and chewing gum, and cookies that she had baked. And I would do everything, make everything, and make it look old. And then packed it all up in this box again and just put it on his dressing room table and didn't say anything. Because we knew each other, but didn't communicate. I never went to a meal with him while we were shooting, but I watched him open this thing, and something happened. And then he came over and asked if he could borrow my leather jacket, which I always wore, air jacket, and to wear in the... So the only problem was that the ending, all through this thing, there's a cow having a calf. And this poor family from Europe is trying to take care of this cow and calf and making terrible noises on the piano. The family can't sleep. They can't stand these people because they're too proud to accept anything or to eat in the dining room. And it's because they were hunted down by the Nazis and they need privacy. So, but they don't get that. They just think they don't talk to people. And so when this boy comes home, he discovers what it is, because the piano that comes banging out of that barn at night and keeps this farm family awake is only the left-hand part of something else. And the Paul character, or Paul's character, Everett, recognizes it. And he goes down and stands behind this guy in the middle of the night and just puts his hand on the piano and completes what the guy is. And then there's recognition, and he pierces the guy's masquerade, and it warms everything.
Yeah, that's great.
So he's the catalyst. And at the climax, the calf is born, and they carry it in. And now this is live TV in RCA above Radio City Music Hall. And I'm on the phone all through rehearsal, calling farmers everywhere, because it's November, about a new calf. And then the headquarters would call me and say, they found one in Maryland. And I said, how old? 6 months. No, it's got to be newborn. And so this was going on all through rehearsal, and I didn't get to see Paul at all except the rehearsals. And so finally, one day, the day that we had dress rehearsal in the morning, and we're going to put it on the air that night, there was a call. I was in the control booth writing an alternate ending because there was no calf. And it was down at the loading station downstairs. We've got a truck here. We got a calf in it. How big is it? Oh, just barely standing. I said, well, please send it up. And the assistant producer was with me. He said, get it up right now. So it didn't come up, and then there was another call. We called back and said, where's the damn calf? Well, we just got word that they won't let it come upstairs without its mother. So the assistant producer said, "I won't let stage mothers on my set." So they decided to bring the calf back up anyway, and we literally, I picked it up and I ran through the door and handed it to Herbert Berghoff, showed him how to hold it, and he put it, we tied it behind a flat so that it would be there for the end of the picture, but it was just hilarious.
That's a great story.
Anyway, we did Thunder of Silence, and the calf worked and everything. And then, as with everything, you're all working together, and friendships are formed and not formed. And Paul and I were not friends. I hadn't had a meal with him. Too busy. And so everyone's packing up to go their separate ways. Thanksgiving's coming up the next week. And Paul was packing up, and we knew we couldn't leave each other. We didn't say that, but he said, where are you walking? Why don't we take a walk? So I said, well, I go east to get the First Avenue bus uptown. I was staying with my parents. But I said, I always pass St. Patrick's Cathedral after I have a TV show on to thank him, to thank God for letting me live through it and for the number of people whom I was able to reach with this tonight. So Paul said, well, I'll walk with you. So we walked east. And then we got to First Avenue and waiting for the bus. And he said, the hell with the bus. I've walked your way, now you walk my way. So we turned and walked west all the way to the Russian tea room where he was going to meet this illicit woman who was the love of his life and who was an understudy in Picnic. And her name was Joanne Woodward. So that was the last night of Thunder of Silence. Wow. Was my meeting with Joanne.
Wow.
And Paul and Joanne and I became incredible friends. And like every other night, friends for years and years and years. I became the godchild of their first. The godfather of their first. I was at their wedding. I smuggled Paul down to Las Vegas from his Mexican divorce and put him through a hot shower and a cold shower. The book that I have, just a photograph of getting him sober and ready to get married that night. And we just were brothers. And then after the marriage and the honeymoon, I guess I was the first guest they had in the house they rented on. But it was just, where are you going? I'm going to Paul and Joanne's. It was like that.
That was here in Los Angeles?
Yeah, up in Laurel Canyon. And then it just developed that way, and skipped to Sybil. And I had written Sybil after many, many, many adventures and a lot of research in Kentucky with multiple personality people, and Dr. Wilbur coming here and me going there. And that was a 2-year project to get that written. And but finally, there was a casting balk on the part of NBC. Has to be a star. And I knew it couldn't be a star. Natalie Wood was pushing so hard to be in it. And I adored her. She had been wonderful in Rebel. But I didn't want Natalie in the picture because that would be Natalie Wood as. And so Joanne agreed. And we had hired an actress to come in and read with all the actors that we had come in to audition for Sybil, and some of the best women actors came. But Joanne said, I'm not going to let them read with anybody except me. So she read with everybody for the entire day. And I was dead tired at lunchtime, and they said Sally Field is the last for this morning. And I thought, oh, fuck the flying nun, you know. Oh, spare me. But I decided that I had to be polite, so I went in, but I fell asleep. She had begun, and it was very low-key, and I woke up with a start and looked around the room, because whoever I fell asleep on had awakened enchanted and different, and so different that it was unbelievable. And Joanne was on her hands and knees. Sally was across the room under a desk, and she had turned into Peggy Lou, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And there was no question in any of our minds, except the director, who was this Englishman, whom I had recommended, and a wonderful director, but he had no idea about what to do with this little 95-year-old character. He wanted Vanessa Redgrave. I said, standing on what ladder? You know, I mean, Jesus. But we had a terrible time. He began shooting the picture, and then he was moved off it. And Dan Petrie came on and did a genius job of directing. But there was that moment when there was no leading lady, and they wanted a star, and I didn't want Natalie. And NBC, well, Audrey Hepburn. That's the last. We're going to send it to Audrey Hepburn. They sent it. She didn't want to do it. So they said the picture's off. Mm-hmm. So I went up to Joanne and Paul's house on Heather Road here for a hamburger. And I was just, my head was very low. And Joanne said, what's the matter? And I told her. And she said, well, do you think it would help if I offered to play Dr. Wilbur? And I said, I have no idea. She said, well, it might be fun because I played the multiple in Three Faces of Eve. Mm-hmm. And should I call? So I said, yes. And she called, and the phone ended with her saying, okay, I'll be there for rehearsal. She got it made.
Tell me this. Can you describe how the actual job came about of writing Rachel?
Oh, it was very simple. What happened was that I hadn't worked in a long time, and Joanne hadn't done anything she had loved since Three Faces of Eve. She had done a lot of pictures, and she and Paul had. But her agent, John Foreman, sent her this book. He had read a review, and she read it and wanted to do it. And she asked me to read it. So she said, if you like it, then maybe we could work together and we'll both get stopped being punished. So I read it, and it was a very moving book. It wandered. It had no center, and it was all internal. It was her inner voice the whole time. So there were many, many just plain problems.
Technical problems.
How do you externalize this very shy, internalized person? And so we had a meeting we had a few meetings, but we had a meeting at Joanne and I, and she was going to produce it. Paul had nothing to do with it. She was going to produce it. And she became this executive, like Cheryl Crawford or somebody. And I had to be, it's totally different from the night before when we were having hamburgers. Yeah. And so we were going through it, and I said, Joanne, this scene, I think it's really important to keep the scene where she masturbates. And Joanne said, well, okay. I said, well, I don't know how a woman masturbates. Do they lie on their back, or do they lie on their stomachs? And she said, I think we better ask Paul. So she called into Paul. She said, we have a question. So he came in and said, what? I said, it's, does a woman masturbate on her back or on her stomach? He said, oh, Stewart. I said, well, that doesn't help. He said, well, maybe it's a little above both. I said, well, I really need to know. And Joanne said, I can't really answer for anybody but myself. And so I said, well, I can't work unless I have one voice telling me what to do. I can't do this. So I went home, and the next day I was in my den, and I was trying to write, and there's a motorcycle, police motorcycle outside, and I thought, and it stopped, and I thought, what's that? And I got out, and I looked, and up the stairs on Carlton Way, which is behind my house, is this limousine flying 2 Nazi flags. And out of it comes Newman, dressed like Himmler. And he pounds in. He said, you want one opinion about what to do? I said, yes. He said, mine. I said, okay. He said, Heil. I said, Heil. And he got into it and flew away. So I knew I had to work it all out with Paul.
That's really fun.
But that was the beginning.
So he then was on the project, obviously.
He was on the project. He said, I am not only on this project. He said, if Rachel is strong enough, finds the strength in herself to leave home and show her ass, he said, I'm going to show mine. I'm going to direct this mother. And he had never directed a feature.
Wow.
And he showed his ass. And from that time, we were bonded.
You had said earlier that
internal.
That was internal. So, and that was a big problem. So how did you solve the problem?
I became Rachel. I mean, it sounds odd, but I had to become Rachel in all those scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a way of breaking it so that it wasn't told straight, since she was so internalized. And she was chastising herself all the time for not being this or for not being that. That she was, and there was a line in it, in the book, so called, I'm not going to think about that. That kind of illusion where she's not going to think about it, and then suddenly she's home, and she's arrived with some chocolate her mother wanted her to pick up at the store on the way home, and you come into a scene where she's coming in to have dinner with her mother before this all happens, and I had to mesh so many stories. And one of the ruling ones was that there was an infantile paralysis epidemic among the children, the school children. So I thought, well, what could be the most important and the most life-changing incident? What does Rachel really want to be? And I realized that she sees her father totally absorbed with this epidemic and all that that means. And with us, it meant scheduling a scene in which Rachel, as a child, sees two children in their coffins who have been elegantly attended to and who have flowers, and she knows something about her father, and he works with dead people, and he never touches her. She doesn't realize that it's because he doesn't want to contaminate her with anything he brings up from that cellar where he embalms people. She's too young to understand that. And so I wanted to make a scene where she has a misunderstanding that can become the key scene in this whole film in terms of change and understanding. So I began reading everything I could on embalming. And in an old book, and I had to get out of my house. I was living on Harold Way. And these books just began. You could hear the pulse of them in the house finally. And I found how to attach, how to treat somebody like Jane Mansfield, whose head had come off. And what kind of things to order in order to shove this stake down into this behind the collarbone and fit the head on, and what to hold it on with, and all these things that you could buy, and things that looked like caps. If you wear caps on your eyes, eye caps, that you can get them made of like little miniature cheese graters where they fit over your eyeball perfectly, but they have little hooks on the outside. So you could just put them against the eyeball and pull the lid and let it go. And it'll catch on these little hooks.
Wow.
So the eye won't open during the funeral. And I was really reading everything I could, And then I found this one thing, which was that when you embalmed in those days, it was gravity, and you could help the gravity by squeezing a rubber bulb, and that would force the embalming fluid in, and that would push the blood out, and that in the instance of a child or a baby being embalmed, that it couldn't get to where it needed to just without that. With that, you had to manually hold the child and press the blood wherever the capillaries were, so that the child would be completely embalmed. And I thought, Jesus, what does that look like? That looks like love. And so I thought that would be the image that Rachel as a child comes upon. And that's what makes her want to be dead, so her father can love her. Because the dead get the love. And so that's the scene that I wanted to have as the changing thing. And I worked with the funeral director a lot about that. And Paul, when he came to the set, and he had, been with the set and the day before and laid things out and everything, he said, no, I'm not going to shoot it. I'm not going to shoot it. And we're all there ready to, with the camera and everything else. And I said, why? He said, 2 reasons. One, my daughter is playing Joanne as an 8-year-old, and my daughter is 8 years old, and I don't want her seeing, much less participating in this. And I said, your daughter, Paul, is number 1, my goddaughter, and number 2, all you have to do is go home and open your refrigerator where she gets her sandwiches, and where you frost your beer mugs, and you'll see roadkill on every other shelf that she collects to feed her hawks with. I said, she knows more about death than you do. So he mused on that about a while, but he said, I still don't, I can't do it. So then we brought the undertaker who was watching, and he said, I can't watch another rehearsal of this. I can't stand it. He said, I've seen it, I've done it, but to stand outside it and look at it, I can't. And he was crying. He had to go outside. So Paul agreed. I got the cutter 3 or 4 times. I had to do this to get him to shoot it. And another time was when Jim, whatever his name was giving Joanne her first sex. It was the first sex scene, the only one really, where you saw them from and he shot that. We found it was supposed to be against a river at night, and we found a place. It wasn't a river, it was a lake, but he figured, if it was dark and you could see some light reflected off the lake, that it wouldn't. But when we came to shoot it, he said, no, it doesn't mean anything. We can't shoot it because there's no light on the lake. I said, well, I can make some light on the lake. I'll swim back and forth, and you can see the froth of my feet. And so he said, well, it probably won't work. Well, all right, let's do it. Let's do one. And he stood, Jim was here lying down on Joanne, who was there, and the lake is here. I'm swimming back and forth to try and throw reflection, and he's like this. I have stills of him. He never let them alone. He was standing looking right there, because Jim wasn't going to get away with anything with Joanne. So that was the other conflict. But this one was, it was difficult, and he softened it, I'm afraid to say, because he had the undertaker, Rachel's father, have a towel in his hand. So he was pressing it through with the towel, and I thought that the naked hand against the naked body was 10 times more telling. And it has to be convincing enough for her to try and be dead or to play dead, because her action that I gave her was to, when she sees this, she sees the body basket that the corpse had been just delivered in, and she has a flower that she took from one of the dead children that she passed upstairs in their coffins, and she creeps into this basket and just lies in the basket with the flower and closes the lid on herself. And that's what the father hears, and he whips it open, and he says, "Get up, get up, get up," and races upstairs from the cellar with it and said, May, get out. She's been in the room. She's got to be scrubbed right away. And all that time, this little girl is kissing his neck all the time. And it's like the first affection that you've ever seen between the little girl. Mm-hmm. And it comes back during the tabernacle scene and all that. So I had to constantly look for those revelatory high points that didn't take explanation, and also find a way of bringing the present into the past and the past into the present without stopping. So when Rachel is walking home with her friend, the other teacher, and she's supposed to bring her mother the candy that she ordered that morning, and she's walking home, and her friend is walking her home, and it's at night, and the friend is trying to talk her into coming to the tabernacle with her sometimes, and Joanne doesn't want to do it. But they come to the crossing of the ways, and the friend says, You gotta know, Joanne, you gotta know, Rachel, that there are more flavors in this world than just vanilla. There are 30 other flavors plus a flavor of the month, and you have to try coming with me. And Joanne says, "Oh." And anyway, it comes through nighty night, and they say nighty night, and Joanne walks one way, and Calla walks the other, and as Joanne turns, she hears in memory, "Slaughter, slaughter, undertaker's daughter, slaughter, slaughter," and she goes toward it, and what happens is that the camera takes Joanne behind a tree, and child Rachel continues to the walk, and she sees the basket, and she has the interplay with her father. What do? I'm just going to make him happy again and give him his lovely smile. Now, go on upstairs. I'll count to 12, count to 2, count to 10. Go up. All right. And the child starts behind the house and then starts up the stairs. One's used up. 2, 3, 3.5, 3 3/4. And then, boom, the door opens upstairs, and the Joanne, who has been remembering all this, walks in, and her mother says, "Did you get the chocolate?" You know, and Joanne says, "I forgot." So it was breaking time into those things without ever stopping.
That's great.
And finding those things that would make this not a casual survey of any old summer. It had to be a special summer. And I had a line that Paul and I fought for. He said, because I had a line where she goes upstairs to the teacher's office and helps her catch her canary, Miss Purinton, and put it back in its cage. And they talk about what they're going to do during the summer. And Calla says, "What are you going to do, sit with Mama?" And Rachel says, "I don't know." And Calla gives her a miniature tree to meditate on and to imagine herself in, and hold it up, and she'll feel peaceful. It's a gift she gives her. Rachel, while she's talking to her friend, says, This is my last ascending summer. From now on, it's just rolling down the hill and into my grave." And Paul gave me hell for driving to Connecticut in his mini bug with the
big engine
in it. And he said, "That you can't even say that." He said, "I want the actor to feel those. You can't. That's an expository line, and you can't say it." I said, "You have to, Paul. This is the fulcrum on which the whole tension of this film rests. This is my last ascending summer. This isn't a generalized anything. There's time that's passing, and she has to do it this summer. That's what she tells herself, so that everything that happens has to have significance." And he said, "Well, say it." So I said, "This is my last ascending summer." He said, "Why do you do that?" I said, "Well, I do it because I am so frightened of my mother criticizing me that I have learned to be very careful about what comes out of my mouth. And I want to be very sure before I say those words. So it comes out, they're placed in space like a picador, landing his picks in the hump of the bull that he's softening up for the kill. And so she has to squeeze them out. And even when she laughs, he said, pinch it. I said, "That's right. She has to pinch everything." He said, "Pinch it." Okay. So then we got home, and he called Joanne to the dinner table. She was practicing piano. He said, "Joanne." She said, "What?" He said, "I have an idea." She said, "Well, it better be short because I don't want to be directed. Face me in the right direction and say, 'Go,' and then I'll go. But I don't want to be talked to during this filming." And so he said, "I'm not even going to say anything." He said, "I'm just going to do this. When you see me do this, you do this. Pinch it. Everything. pinch it, even a laugh.
That was your mother too.
Yeah, you had to be very careful.
If you could tell a story about your, I believe you were watching a Bergman film while you were writing Teresa,
Yeah.
which was your first screenplay, is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so why don't you introduce that topic and then tell that story?
Well, in the days when I was starting working on the research for Teresa, I was very fortunate because Broadway movie houses were continuous all day. You could go in from 9 in the morning until practically midnight, and they would just repeat the film and the news, whatever, and if there was a stage show, that went too. But you could sit there all day, and nobody ever cleared the theater, made you leave. And so I was able to do that, and I was very, very fond of what I had seen of Ingmar Bergman's work, which was not very much at that time. But Torment was playing, and I had seen Torment with Alf Schelin and Mai Zetterling and a sadistic school teacher whose name I forget conveniently. But it was a superb film. And I can't remember who the director was. I just know that Bergman did the screenplay. And I thought I had remembered certain shots in it. And I certainly had, as a dialogue director, when Joe Fields got me that job, I was reading screenplays all the time. And the screenplays always had direction for the shots, but it was always very dull, and I was noticing that directors very seldom did exactly what was said and what was written in the instructions about the shot. And I really wanted to find a vocabulary that would be visual, and especially for everything. To think there and you're not thinking of a canvas, but you're thinking of a moving canvas. So having seen Torment, I thought I'm going to take my notebook to Torment and I'm going to draw every shot, every important shot, so that I can see what a high angle long shot is, what this is, what that is. And so I did. And so one of my earliest notebooks that I show my students is just page after page of illustrations, very well drawn, of those scenes, those shots and the shot of from the school down after the graduation in the rain, where all the people, the parents of the children who are graduating, including Vidgrin, I think his name is, the boy, are seen as opening umbrellas. Well, certainly our town was the one that created the umbrella having to do with death, because that's what the impression on stage is. They're all sitting there under open umbrellas, the dead. But he used it very differently. So there's one sketch from way up on high where he's looking down at all these umbrellas and all the ways of placing an actor on a stairway and where the light can be too. So it was very careful that way, how you can isolate or how you can bring mood to a scene by the tonality of it, or the juxtaposition of people, or the foreshortening or lengthening of objects, what an object can mean, like the candy bowl in the Joe Mankiewicz film about the actress with Betty Davis. Every time she passed it, you think, is she going to take it? Is she going to? And finally, she dips in and she takes it, and it adds, it's a texture to the scene that's so visual and so dramatic.
Tell us about how you work.
I had a kind of ritual. At the time, I was in Al-Anon because I had so many alcoholics in my life. So I would say certain prayers when I got to the studio. And I always needed a couch. So even if I had slept well, I would give myself time on the couch. And I would just lie down and try and catch that moment when you're almost asleep, but not quite. And where you're not guarded against images and things that might come floating through. And just turn over and make a note and then go back again. And it was very inert. And if I had pages from the day before, then that could activate me, because I would always start reading at the beginning of the script. Even if I were on page 124, I'd read all that before I began. And it added to an increment to spring forward with. And if there was a church in sight, I'd get up and look at the church. I'd write on the top of my yellow pages, "Oh God, please relieve me from this suffering, relieve me from this fear." And but it was always a ritual. And I'm not writing now, and I have to start because I've been working for 3 years on an autobiographical film about my own childhood on the farm at Uncle Adolph's. And it's got some great scenes in it. I've written completely in screenplay, Act 3. And there's a lot ahead, and it's really mechanical, a lot of it. And Marilee is going to work with me and just insist that there are pages every day. And that helps. And also, I've learned about timed writing. And that's an enormous help in opening myself up.
Explain what that is.
It's where I give you a start line, or we all sit around the table, each one writes a start line. The most dramatic one for me was just a number. But you say, anything. I was falling down the street. I tripped on the curb when, and you start without thinking. You write, I tripped on the curb when, boom, and you just shoot ahead. And for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, and they should be varied in terms of length, starting short. And it goes around the table, and then you read what you wrote during your start line. Some go very long. I had one when I was working at Sundance one summer where I knew that this girl had written a whole screenplay and not realized who the protagonist was. And it was about a Thanksgiving dinner in a big brownstone home of a lot of people living in the same place, and everybody brought a dish, and it was Thanksgiving, and it was wonderful dialogue, and not about anything. And so I thought, I wonder if she found the protagonist. And so I gave her a start line. And I said, I want you to write from the point of view of the protagonist, or of the person who was not invited to this celebration. And write as her. It was the sister of the one who was there. And the start line is, it's Thanksgiving, and I don't know where to go. 10 minutes. And the table began to jiggle. She was writing furiously. And I turned it off when I saw it was 10 minutes and turned it on to another.
That's all right.
Another half hour. And just about when that half hour ended, the table stopped. And I looked at her, and she had her arm on the table and her head in the crook of her arm, and she was sobbing. I said, what is it? She said, my sister. I brought her to the tribal party. And that had started everything she needed, all the backstory. I was just fiddling in the dark, but that thing can get you, and it gets behind any planning, anything that is cerebral, and goes in for what the emotional story is and the visual story.
Which is what you said all writers have to do to write well.
Yeah.
To get to some real feeling, some real emotion inside of them.
That's all people want to see. They want to know they're not alone when they come into a theater. You know, women coming alone to a matinee, whoever it is who comes in out of the rain. And you never know. And I had a situation in the Philippines when I was working on The Ugly American, when everybody was calling the hotel to speak to Marlon Brando. And we were on a protected floor with a machine gun on one end of it, and a guard posted there, and people still climbing up the ivy on the outside of the hotel trying to get into Marlon's room. And just three of us, Marlon, George England, and me, on this whole uninhabited floor. And one day a call came for me, and I couldn't believe it really was for me in the Philippines. And this young man wanted to come up and see me. And he was about 15 maybe, from an island to the north of where we were. And with him, he brought his mother and father. And so I ordered tea. I'm going to cut this very short. I ordered tea. I did all the niceties. And one thing you don't do in Thailand is what I'm doing now, which is to point at anybody with your foot. And the next thing is never to ask why people came. So I ordered tea, and we made nice, and, you know, he could translate a little bit of what they were saying, but he had trouble too. And finally, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this boy says, "You're tearing me apart. He says one thing, she says another, and everybody's mad at me." I said, "Where did you get that?" He said, "Rebel without a cause." I said, "Then what happens?" And he went on with the scene.
Wow.
And not a sign of an accent.
Wow.
And when he spoke, you know, it was hard for him to speak English. And I thought, oh my God. And then he said that he had seen it 30 times. And each time after the first time, he had begged his parents to come and see the picture. And they wouldn't. And they said it wasn't for them, and it wouldn't, and he just begged them. So they went. And he said that was when we became a family. He said after that, they began asking me questions, and I could ask them, and we were able to talk about what they were before I was born, and what their lives, how they fell in love, and this and that and the other thing. And I just couldn't believe it. So I said, well, and they're all thanking me. So we ended up, all four of us, with our arms around each other crying. And said, thank you from my family. And I thought, I remember writing this in that apple green billiards room at Warner Brothers, not knowing who was going to hear it or what it would mean, could possibly be.
Yeah.
But it was a big lesson in what people go to the movies for. They want to know that they're okay, for one thing. One day, after George England, whom I had not heard of, who was married to Cloris Leachman, and who was a fine Broadway director and a Kennedy-like persona, who very rapidly got to know Kennedy and who got to know this one and that one, and was hired by the government of Iran when the coup came that changed to the Shah, and he was working with the Shah on development of a much more personalized and individual recognition for people, democratized. And he was advisor, and then the revolution happened, and out went the Shah. But he has that demeanor that is so commanding, and he's very handsome and very authoritative, way beyond what his experience should have. And there's nobody who isn't impressed with him or attracted to him. And he uses that, as most people do who are like that, to manipulate for his own advantage. But fortunately, he has a worldview. And so it not only restores or regenerates his feeling about himself as a talented person, but gives him an opportunity to exercise it. And so he had seen the rack, and he called me out of the blue. I had never heard of him. And he asked me whether I would be interested in finding out more about the work of the United Nations in other countries in terms of what the expert volunteers do in the field. Those people in midwifery, in the fight against bilharzia or schistosomiasis in the medical field. Those people in sanitation who are trying to introduce toilets into the netherlands of underdeveloped countries. And every aspect, food and agriculture and all those things. And he had interested Marlon Brando in doing it, and in Pennybaker, which was Brando's private company that he had made his father president of, and he couldn't stand his father. But they wanted to hire me to come with them to Southeast Asia and to do research with them to see if we could find a story that we could dramatize and make a film from, a dramatic movie from. And so they took me, and I mean, you could talk forever about that whole thing. My relationship with Brando, whom I held on as high a pedestal as I had Monty Clift, and everybody had. And to stand in the open window in the middle of winter in a suite in the Plaza Hotel in New York on the eve of my going to the Secretariat of the UN with them the next day to begin the research, and wondering, why me? How did this happen that I'm here with Brando and with this man who is so directed and so charming and can, manipulate everything. And they're taking me with them around the world to be the documentarian for them. And I was just standing there sort of torn between suicide and freezing to death. And I had nothing on except my towel around my waist, and the snow was coming in through the window and landing on my shoulder at 3 a.m. or something. And then Marlon sneaked in from his room, and I felt his arm around me. And I said, I didn't know what to do. And he said, Stews, you wouldn't be here if I didn't love you. And I said, yeah, what else? He said, let's talk. So we sat on his bed, or he sat on mine, and he told me all about his childhood and his fears. And anyway, it was full out giving. And he won me. And he defanged himself. He was no longer the invulnerable person. And I found that when I would get terrified, have panic attacks, long after, that he was the one I would call at night and say, Marlon, I can't sleep. And he'd say, I'll put some fruit by the bedside in the guest room. I'll leave the key under the mat. And I would come up there, and the bed would be turned back, and, it would just be, don't wake me in the morning. And but I felt safe there. And then you wouldn't hear from him for 6 months, and then suddenly he'd be on your doorstep, and he'd say, somebody said you needed a ride to the airport today, and you'd take me. So, but that was this mercurial, unpredictable man. And so we all went to Southeast Asia, where that happening happened with the boy. And we went to the Philippines. We went to what was then Ceylon. We went to the New Territories, which was bordering on China. We went to Burma. We went to Pakistan.
Wow.
We went just really a lot of Southeast Asia countries, and talking to everybody, talking to ambassadors, talking about political problems, dates with President Sukarno in Indonesia, and then being sent out to Burma or to Bali to a certain master dancer whom we would sneak through the forest at night with candles to find, teaching the Legong girls, how to bend their fingers back and do all of the chant dances and we were everywhere. And even to a place that had been a kind of miniature Angkor Wat, this stone, wonderful place with tangled wildwood and vines and ancient kind of pagoda places and prayer places and constant movement in the night along the dirt trails and the sound of animals and open porches to sleep on. But because it was a new hotel, it had a toilet, and a real toilet, shaped like one, but it was made of granite, and I thought, finally a toilet, because my ass was falling out by those, the squatting over a hole in the floor with a big tub of water and a calabash to pour over your head. And God, it was heaven. The only point was that it just looked like a toilet. You sat on it and you did your duty in it, but there was no plumbing. So there was a toilet boy called Sampel,
Wow.
and he came with a room. So he would stand to one side with this long-handled paddle, and he would be there to catch it as it came out. So we had the best of all possible worlds. But it was just endless, and to watch the ancient storytellers, writers, to watch them hold a crowd by the glow of a lamp, hold them fascinated, and to track the story, even though you didn't know the details, but you could see how they observed the observers and how they could bring the tension up to a certain point and then take it away and then top it from some other direction. And it was such a wonderful way to watch it and to realize that that's in all of us. That storytelling urge is in us all. It's the way we learn from generation to generation before there were pens. Mm-hmm. And we don't trust it. So we have people who write books about this is the way you do it. And this has to be on page 30, and this has to be on here. And so we have all these educated people writing what? You have to look pretty far before your heart is moved now, mm-hmm. and moved by something that's real. And not just noise that flattens your eardrums, mm-hmm. or shocks you so much that and yet there are those perfect films, beautiful films that are much more modest, mm-hmm. and even sometimes very elaborate ones that are moving stories. So, I think stories, but not to substitute noise, mm-hmm. for speech, honest speech, and shock as the only means of. When you get a scene like the one which I'd run for every class, the one in Saving Private Ryan, where Tom Hanks and Matt Damon sit there. And there are people on the church steps who've been playing back and forth, and Tom Hanks is sitting there and keeping rhythm. And then he says something like, or Private Ryan says, "Your teacher?" He says, "Yeah, I'm a teacher." And then somehow they get into, he says, the boy says, "Geez, I can't even remember what my brothers look like." And Hank says, "It's the context. You have to have context." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, like when I think about my wife, I don't think about her. I think about the garden gloves she left in the driveway, and the things you can touch, and then she comes." And he says, "Boy, I can't." He says, "Well, you got to find context." So then Matt Damon goes, and he starts laughing. And he tells the story of his brothers bringing in this hooker who just was almost blinded them with her ugliness, and how it ends up with him knocking over a kerosene lamp and the barn almost burning, and this girl who is so ugly and everything, and he's laughing and laughing and laughing, and then he stops in the middle of his laughing, and he says, yeah, that was the last time we were together." But that, as a lesson in teaching writing, just is incredible. But it's that, it's those things, those simple things that are around what you're trying to remember.
Yeah.
And that's what the method is for actors, to remember not the thing itself, but everything around it. What was it like? What did it smell like?
Yeah.
Whose voices were you hearing? And then, if you're lucky, the emotion comes
out of that,
and it's the same for the writer.
Yeah. We were talking about Ugly American, and you were saying that what was going on, and so how did the project eventually, just tell us quickly how it
The project went, taking us from place to place, writing thousands of pages, literally, of notes, and going through those notes and grabbing this from there and this from there, and making a smaller assembly of notes, and then finally circling in to narrow it down to something that you could manage. And I narrowed it down to the discovery in one of the chapters of how the old ugly American, who is not an ugly American, he's a guy who works with his hands, he's an engineer, and he sees all these bicycles that rusting here and there, and because the Japanese have been through this area, and they're not getting any water up the hill for the terrace rice fields. And he rigs these bicycles, teaches them to rig the bicycles and connect them to bamboo poles that can, if they exert themselves on the bikes, there's a pump within the bike that they use the bicycle treads for a pump to get the water up through this hollow out bamboo from level to level, and that's how that all. And at the end, you have that wonderful satisfaction that this ugly American, using given material and his brains and his passion for the people, has created this amazing discovery. And McWhite, in supporting it, turns out to be a good American, a not ugly American. And also he has a friend in it named DeYoung, who is a nationalist. And there's backplay there and that friendship, because they were together during the war behind the lines in this country. And so we sent that to Thailand and to Ceylon. George England and the producer took it. And all they got was laughter and shaking heads no, and a lot of beetle nut being spit. And they said it couldn't happen. Maybe once in one situation, one odd situation, but that water came from up above and came down naturally. And you had to go and see where that was happening and then dig your containers for the water and whatever. And so suddenly there was no film. And I was told to change everything. And I had worked on it for a year at that point. And I was wrung out, and they couldn't help me. So I quit. No, I was fired, reluctantly. So I went and I wrote The Outsider, the story of Ira Hayes. And then the calls began from George. And he had assigned another writer to The Ugly American that hadn't worked out, a friend of his, and that nobody liked the script. So he said, "You've got to come back." And I said, "I can't lick it, George." And he said, "Well, the minute you're through, come in and let's talk." So we talked. And the outcome of the talk was, we have to go back to our trip to Southeast Asia. Fuck the book, except for that central love story of those two guys, the native who had met the guy who became the ambassador, and that he was appointed ambassador because he knew this guy who many people thought was a communist. And that is what we would do. We would narrow it down to the story of these two and this obstinate, right-thinking State Department employee who could not get it through his craw that he had to answer what the people wanted and not what we thought they should have. And so we moved Brando and DeYoung further away until the communists were able to use this nationalist movement that was for the country and take it over and land paratroopers without these guys even knowing it, these idealists. And then it became the showdown and how to, and the ending of that, which I was so relieved that they kept, because for a major studio to end a film like that was ended, where you go through a whole revolution and you come to the entire press of a nation with the ambassador in a corner saying, did you just lose Sarkhan for us? For this revolution out there? And the assassination of de and all this stuff? And, you know, and the ambassador saying, no, I failed. I failed. You could say I failed. Just as the American people have failed because we don't recognize our own aspiration in the aspiration of these people. We came into being through revolution, through the overthrow of tyrants, and that's what these people are trying to do. And our role is too often the role of the tyrant, or the role of someone who will not listen, who won't see what's really happening and what the people really want. And if I had one thing to tell to the American people, and then you cut away to just Mr. Anybody in New York or Los Angeles sitting in the room watching television with a can of beer in one hand and a sandwich in the other, and as the ambassador on television says, if I had one thing to tell the American people, he just goes to the TV set and turns it off. And nobody had ever ended a movie
That's
like
great.
that. And we had to fight with Universal.
That's great.
But they had the, I don't know what, willingness and sensibility and caring to let the picture end like that.
That's wonderful.
Make a list. Of all the secrets that you've kept from everybody and why you've kept them secrets. Where you got the idea of that. Write a list of all the things you've seen that you can't forget because they were so funny. And all the things you've seen or heard or experienced that you can't forget because in some way or other they changed your life. Or made you want to live a different way, and what way? Or made you want to die, and how do you imagine that? And just make a list of all those things that really have meaning and that are secrets that nobody ever needs to know are yours. See as many movies as you can. See the following, and I'd include a list of movies that go back to black and white, that go back to a movie like Grass, that was a silent, that was written and produced and acted in and everything by Schoedzek and Marion, who were the first to make King Kong, and who did that whole series of documentaries for Paramount. Chang, the story of a family who live in India, elephants. Rango, the same with orangutan. Grass, which was this unbelievable story of the movement of 100,000 people and animals annually to find grass in the sort of Turkish, in that sort of entrance to that sea almost where Troy was, I don't know. And the others, the best of Chaplin. But to go back to some of the silence and come forward, find lists of the 100 greatest films, and watch them 3 or 4 times, 5 times, and make notes of what moves you. Make those anyway about whatever you see that moves you. Find a way of making a list of the things you look for in a movie and check that against yourself. Read one book about structure, but know, reading it, that this is not a set of rules. There are no rules for a film. There are emotions. There is a sense of how, first of all, what your theme is, what underneath everything you're trying to say in the best and most secret way of saying it. Who you can talk to find out more about it. Give yourself the courage to approach strangers and find out about what they do in the world and make friends with them, whether it's an undertaker or the president of a studio or the president of an industry. And just know that when you're treated like dirt by somebody and you resent them, a boss, whatever it is, whom you resent in your life and who's reached a certain age, look at them very carefully and visualize them on the second day they were born, when their mother looked at them through glass and a nurse was holding them. And look at that child and realize that that was once in this gross son of a bitch who is sitting across from you. And try and figure out in your heart how this became that. Read, especially novels, and not just contemporary ones. Learn about historical periods and what attracts you in what period, so that you can write a story with conviction about Alexander the Great, but know what his problems were. Read Mary Renault if you want to read about ancient Greece, this writer who lived in South Africa and who did The King Must Die and the, whatever it was, I don't know, all her books, I think. Find a book you love or that has a background that you're not familiar with, and to make the book your own, go to the background and live among those people and be open to do anything, taste anything, and mark everything down. But mark everything down the minute it happens. You have to have a recorder or a camera. Now you have everything all in one. And there's no excuse for not leaving with an encyclopedia of the depth and the breadth and the visual impact of whatever it is, whether it seems to fit or not. But you'll find as you settle on some subject, on some character, that you'll gradually not be able to notice anything that doesn't have to relate to that. And remember that the rules that people make are simply lists of their observation of what great things in the past seem to have observed. They are not laws. The climax, in a way, of Rachel came at the end of Reel 2, when she went through what she did at the tabernacle. And the rest were other further tests as she got more closer and closer to what could be, and got courage from that. And make reports of what you read. Make reports of what you see. What did you love? What were you most moved by? Why were you moved? Make a form for every movie you go to see. What does it seem to be about? What is it really about? What does who is the protagonist? Who is the antagonist? What is their main point of collision? How do they make up? Or don't they? Talk to other people. Talk to people who know more than you do about something. And be able to look at yourself and know what you really believe, what you really feel. Because if you're writing from that kind of truth and confession and disguising it however you may, by moving the time or by moving the place or by moving the profession, whatever it is, you can be unafraid. The more disguise you give it, the more unafraid you can be. And if you're afraid of stepping on somebody's toes, I have stepped on my parents' toes in everything I've ever written, and they've never once realized it was them. And my mother would say, "Oh, God, don't show this to your father." And my father would say, "Sheesh, did your mother see this?" But they don't recognize themselves, and especially when somebody else is playing them. And also seek out the things that frighten you most and do them. And that includes writing. And that includes me. And if you can find a friend to work it with, if you both have something that you're terrified of rendering, get together, and remember that when I was writing the last movie, the screenplay, with Dennis Hopper circling the room, and I was very conventional person, even though I'm the only person I know who had Jim Morrison come to his house for dinner and then take him to the recording session, that I had Dennis walking around me, amazed at what I was typing from what he was saying. And almost as fast as he was saying what he was saying, I was typing a version of it. And how I would put on my mask and snorkel, and he would blow the pot smoke down through the snorkel So I would just get high enough, but not too high, to keep on going.
That's a great story to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.